Alright, dude, this castle's driving me nuts. I keep losing track of where we're going, where we are, and where we need to go.
We only have one more mass to get. Why don't you check the map?
Alright, just one moment. Let's see, so... We're in the...
Oh, hey,
the
shiny.
lobby. We need to get to second floor in the library.
Sweet mother of...
What? Oh, Jesus! Just back off and let us pass. Alright, we have no business with you.
Well.
Big fat flappy chug-a-lug jugs.
Two filthy man things have wandered into my castle.
No, we're here for my daughter, okay? Just, please, stay out of our way, let's go find her.
So
All right.
do you get visitors here often? Are you free on weekends? Or
There, what are you doing?
So how much would it cost for you to just step on me with one leg?
Alright. Well, back in 2017, a little game came out called Resident Evil 7 that kind of flipped the franchise upside down on its head and did some changes that probably nobody saw coming.
A literal and figurative game changer. The game changed the way we look at Resident Evil. It introduced a new main character to the series and took a turn back towards the survival horror elements that brought fans to love the game from the beginning of the series.
And now, as of 2021, we get our follow-up to Resident Evil 7. And I played it on PlayStation 5. He's going to be playing it on PlayStation 4. So, we're going to get a little bit of two perspectives here. But either way, we're going to get the same experience, hopefully. And there's been a lot going on around this game. Capcom's definitely been hyping it up. They've had the ball on the roll. And there's been a certain Lady D that keeps popping up everywhere you look on the internet.
Is definitely going crazy about this game.
That's putting it lightly. So, you know what? Let's hope that it lives up to expectations. Let's hope it's a worthy next installment to the series.
Resident Evil.
Alright. Here we go.
Let's do it.
Resident Evil 8. I'm Dutch,
And I'm Metanoia.
and this is our Resident Evil 8 review. The next anticipated entry of a highly well-respected horror series that has gone on since we were young. Boy, do we have a lot to say on this.
I've been playing the Resident Evil series since the director's cut of the first game. I've played every entry in the series, and this is definitely a solid inclusion in both the canon and the gameplay arc of Resident Evil.
And for me, my entry was with Resident Evil 4. I was just given it one day, and then the ball kind of went on the roll from there. Resident Evil 5, 6, 7, and then dialing back to some of the older games in the franchise. I've dabbled in a little bit of everything, but Meadows definitely had a long history of exposure around Resident Evil. So We've been highly anticipating this one, and whether it lived up to those expectations or failed, why don't we dive into that?
So my description of this game would be that it's a very solid horror shooter, maybe even along the lines of the Fear franchise or something like that. I would not necessarily call this a survival horror game, much in the same respect like Resident Evil 7 moved away from the mold of the gameplay style of the other Resident Evil games.
Resident Evil 7 was definitely a strange change. Part of me almost wondered if it was like trying to ride off of something that PT did, the mark that it made on the face of gaming.
Yeah.
But regardless, I think it turned out well. And so I was pretty curious to see what, when I looked at 8, I perceived it as, okay, so it reminds me a lot of 4, and it's just continuing Ethan's story. Alright, you got my attention at least, so let's see how this plays out.
I would agree with that. I think that 7 was an attempt to correct a pendulum swinging too far to the action side, and that pendulum swinging back the other direction in 7 was maybe even an overcorrect. They brought the horror back into the series, they brought the resource management back and the real overwhelmingness of foes, but it almost became a survival game along the lines of... I can't think of any titles off the top of my head, but the games where you hide from the monster that chases you around. Outlast is a good example. It just had that feel where you were helpless against these enemies in the game until very late in the game.
Right.
And 8 corrected that. It went back to a more action-centered model where the game still felt scary, the enemies still felt overwhelming and more powerful, the environments were still terrifying, but you weren't defenseless against this. I think we've both made the comparison that if 7 was similar to 4, then 8 was definitely similar to 5.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair way to put it. It is funny that you also mentioned the horror aspect, because they said, I think the director mentioned that they wanted to dial it down because apparently they thought 7 was too scary, which, I mean, you kind of get that. A lot of people reference one particular section of the game, making them question that, about the level of fear, but generally, you felt well-armed, well-prepared to take on these lichens, these zombies, vampires, all these sorts of mishmashes of monsters in a Transylvania or Castlevania-like setting, you know?
I think they found a good balance between the horror and the action in the fact that the game still felt scary. There were still sections that were dark and questionable, and I found myself easing the stick forward and walking slowly through sections. I didn't feel overpowered until very late in the game. I was still scared of what might be around the corner, but once I saw what it was, I didn't feel ill-equipped to deal with it like I did in Resident Evil 7.
And that respect about being, equipped for it. I mean, in this game, I never even felt any sort of panic about how much equipment, how much arms I had on backup. I always had a very healthy amount for taking on these enemies, but at the same time, some of these enemies, just like most of the other Resident Evil games, you're gonna have to really dish out a beating on them. For a Lycan, it still takes 4 to 5 headshots to put one down.
Yeah, on normal, a lot of the enemies did feel relatively bullet spongy unless you had your upgrades maxed out, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. As far as resource management was concerned, I really want to point out that this game had an amazing bell curve as far as resource management. Where early game, you felt like you were low on resources, every bullet counted. As you accumulated some money and upgraded your weapons and found items in the environment, as long as you weren't blatantly wasteful, you felt well equipped through most of the game. And then coming out of the final sections of actual gunplay before the big finale kicks off that occurs in the game, it starts to feel again like you're short on resources and every bullet counts. And I really liked that wave of starting off feeling weak, getting strong, and then realizing that you really need to hunker down for these last final difficult sections.
Yeah, and that's kind of similar in the way it went with 7. On the last parts of 8, you do have to hone in because the action, the tension, all of it's ramping up now, so you have to, instead of just kind of willy-nilly with your arms and how you handle situations, be more precise, be more strategic, be more thoughtful of how you're going to be playing out your actions here, because it's going to count as you're faced with new obstacles and new enemy types throughout your playthrough. and the resources will start to dial back in on how scarce they are.
Along that line of thinking, I think that the shop system that they put in this game was done really well. There were areas where you were able to buy heals and ammunition if you needed to, just in case you missed one too many shots in the last section, or you had a surplus of money and you knew you needed to be prepared for an upcoming boss battle. The Duke and his inventory was handled very well with frequent bumps of restock, but it was never just a wholesale spend whatever you want to get more ammo and not have to still deal with the resource management aspect of the game. And we'll talk more about weapons and upgrades later. Some of the more technical aspects of the game was made on the RE engine, I believe it's called.
Yeah, and that started with, I think, 7 was that engine.
So, and the game really didn't look much different graphic-wise from Resident Evil 7. Textures look very similar. I experienced on PS4 some pretty significant texture pop-in and occasional frame rate drops, but all in all, the game looked pretty good. Being in the same engine, we didn't need to expect anything new here, but I just wanted to touch on that the game still looks good. I will say the lighting was particularly well done in contrast to Resident Evil 7, at least for me. There were less areas that seemed too dark. There were better transitions using bloom from bright areas into dark areas. I feel like the game did a lot better job of keeping the lighting appropriate for the scenario.
I'd have to agree with that. And PlayStation 5, which is where I played through the game, it certainly looked good. It kept a very stable, consistent high frame rate. At the same time, it didn't feel like the graphics were that big of a jump from 7, but I don't think it really needed to be. This RE engine has proved itself to be really just amazing looking, but I wouldn't say the graphics exactly blew me away or anything, but that's not what I was, wanting to be the thing to suck me into the game.
I'll even go out on a limb with a hot take and say that I believe this graphics engine could carry the franchise through this generation of gaming.
Probably, if we're being quite honest, because the same engine was used on the Resident Evil 2 remake, it was used on Resident Evil 3, it was even used for, I think, Devil May Cry 5, so it just looks incredible. I don't know what other people would expect for a jump on the next-gen hardware, but for me, I still wound up with a wonderful experience, and I need to touch on real quick, since it is the PS5, it did use the DualSense, and there was a few cool little uses of adaptive triggers or rumble on there. The only one that really stood out to me, though, was whenever I'd take up the sniper scope, and when I'd look down the scope, you could feel the trigger just kind of slowly ease in, and you had to hold it in the right position that you wanted. And if you took a hit, you could feel it rumble on the controller. The lights on the controller would show your health bar too. Just a bunch of simple little things, so bear that in mind if you play that on next-gen hardware, is it's just going to have these extra little touches to kind of take it one step further.
One other thing I want to touch on, as far as technical things are concerned, I think they really dialed in the menus in this game well. The inventory system worked well. The crafting system worked well. It was all a very basic interface, but at the same time, it just did what it needed to do and looked good doing it. There was no menus to drag through. It was all just very streamlined to where you could do what you needed to do and get back to the action, either in the inventory or in the crafting. I found a couple of times that I had to rearrange my inventory, either due to my own mild OCD nature or genuinely needing to rearrange things to pick up an item, but that really only happened twice that I can think of. And they added an amazing feature that's new to the series of having an inventory block where you can hold items temporarily to rearrange and then insert them into the inventory. So there really was no inventory management in this game. In fact, there wasn't even a toy box, which is very much a hallmark of the Resident Evil series. This is the first game, I believe, that we didn't even have an item storage space because it wasn't necessary. The game was paced well enough that you always had room for whatever you picked up. Storing key items separately and treasure separately than the main inventory was a boon, and I think that really tipped the scale in our favor as far as inventory management.
And I do need to touch on, it's kind of like he mentioned earlier, the Duke feels like the merchant from RE4. The way that you have your briefcase to kind of sort through your inventory also feels like the inventory management. The only thing I didn't like about inventory management was I could have swore back in RE4 if I press square to move something here over a different item, I could have hit that square again, and it would pick up the item that I'm moving over, and then can move that somewhere else. But thankfully that sidebar being there to temporarily move stuff around helps with that, so it ain't that bad.
I agree. It could have used the ability to like swap item placement. So if you're like cursoring over just one item with the item you want to drop, being able to swap that item with the one that you're dropping it over to move things around more efficiently would have been nice. But again, this isn't a game-breaking issue. It's more of just a player preference sort of thing.
It's like OCD. I would separate things into separate areas on the screen, health in bottom left, ammo all on right, and explosives in the bottom right corner, stuff like that. So that's just player preference, like he said.
And since we brought up the Duke, I think that the pricing in the shop was fair. The offerings were acceptable. It was interesting to be able to both find weapon attachments in the world and buy them from the Duke, so even if you miss some, if you're not an extremely thorough player or you're speed running, you still are able to just drop some cash on some upgrades for your guns. The payout for treasure items seemed reasonable, and this game has a really cool feature which I enjoyed. Once I realized how big the actual weapon spread was, I wanted to try the other weapons, but I was reluctant to sell my guns back. If I remember correctly, Resident Evil 5, if you sold a gun back to the shop and you wanted to rebuy it, you got the base gun with no upgrades back when you rebought it. In this game, if you sell a gun to the Duke and you decide you want it back later, when you buy it back as the exact stats and with the same modifications that the gun had when you sold it. Which I think is just a quality of life feature that they have overlooked in other games but worked really well in this one.
Precisely. I think another subject that we should probably touch on is just the environment and the world. Of course, that leads into story.
I did have one other comment about the Duke, if you don't mind. I think the ingredient gathering thing was like a great idea that wasn't implemented well. There weren't enough ingredients in game to buy all of the upgrades, so you kind of had to juggle. And it was also the majority of the ingredients were presented so late in the game that the upgrades kind of felt unnecessary that late in the game. I would have liked to have seen the ingredients and cooking mechanic thing introduced sooner and used in a more broader sense across the scope of the game. You know, if you're going to put a side quest in, flesh it out.
I can agree with that, because I wound up missing, like, I think 5 fish, and that screwed me out of, I think, 2 separate final upgrades. I don't know, it just does kind of rub me the wrong way. Maybe I needed to do another full sweep of the map into every little bit and corner, but it did wind up feeling a little too late, I suppose. Next, we'll build on the, setting, the world, the characters just really quick. As we mentioned, this is set in like a sort of Transylvania-like setting. Romania, giant castle of the Lady Dimitrescu, and then the surrounding area of the village, where you're gonna kind of meet each of the bosses, the key challengers of the game. But the big one that, everyone kind of built on, what Capcom was presenting to us, was Lady Dimitrescu herself. And I think the ironic thing of that is her role in the game was actually just something so small, so short, in truth.
For me, I feel like I was sold the idea by advertisements, by the fandom, and maybe I had preconceived notions I shouldn't have had going into the game, but I expected the entire game to take place in Castle Dimitrescu, and for her to be a more looming enemy, similar to Mr. X or the Nemesis. So for that portion of the game to end so early was jarring, and that's an aspect of a pacing that I think they missed the beat on, and I'll talk more about pacing when we get to that point. But it was strange for this to seem like the central point of the game, and then for it to just be gone within a fifth of the total playtime.
And, yeah, that's actually all she wrote, basically. That's her entire part to the game.
What?
Yeah, what the hell?
Yeah, basically your part's more or less done within 2 hours of the game. Sorry.
You storm into my castle, ruin my things, kill my daughters in only a couple of hours?
Wait a minute, wait. That was all just his idea. You know, we can stay and hang out for a while, have a couple of drinks, you can sit on me.
Heisenberg! Get Capcom on the phone!
Wait for me! We could have had so much together!
It's also kind of wild just the way everything kicks off, because it does feel like as you progress through the story, more plot holes start to kind of poke their heads in. Ethan himself, as we stated, he's back. We're continuing his story, his life, after the events of 7, and it's a little bizarre trying to connect the dots, especially initially, because Chris just barging in on the story, not giving us any context of what he's doing and why, which, if he did, that would have saved a lot of trouble.
And it really piques the player's interest to want to know what's going on if they're a fan of the franchise. But for players that have come in late in the Resident Evil franchise, it's not enough of a draw to wonder what Chris is doing to really make them invest in the story. I would like to comment story-wise, though, while we're touching on it. There is a huge tie-in to the Resident Evil canon in this game that actually ties it into the entire canon in a very shocking way. Strangely enough, that tie-in is the last few words of a document found in the end game, and almost no other references to the rest of Resident Evil canon exist in the game except for this document and the few umbrella symbols you find throughout the game. But for players who haven't played yet and are uncertain of whether they want to play this as a canon game in the series, and for players who have played and may have missed it, there is a gigantic bomb drop in this game, tying the events of this game to the rest of Resident Evil canon.
I'd say a lot of bombshells come in within just like the last hour, 2 hours of the game, just quite suddenly. So for the fans, you're gonna get a lot just all of a sudden thrown at you within the last few hours that connects back and gives you a glimpse of, okay, well, this seems to be where the future of the series might be headed. It's probably going to be a lot to take in, but hopefully you'll enjoy it, or find some fascination through it. But yes, as for the story of Resident Evil 8, it's generally good enough to follow. It's just, for you Resident Evil fans, your tie-in, you're going to have to wait for a bit. But following Ethan's story, going on this quest, find his daughter, and find why they want her so bad, and find that it's slowly tying back to Resident Evil 7 and what went on there, that will be a doozy for you.
And they do actually lead the game into hint at where they're going with it. That's extremely interesting. You know, the story doesn't just stop with the final boss battle. We get one more cutscene after that. Pretty enticing, has me looking forward to Resident Evil 9, definitely.
Absolutely. It left me very intrigued just seeing that last cutscene and wondering, okay, I gotta know what's next now. But as for the rest of it, the progression through the village and what you're doing, it feels like a grand adventure. One that's well driven, full of mystique, full of intrigue to guide you through this adventure.
There's one other pro about the game I wanted to bring up, and that is the sheer amount of side content and extras that are in the main game. You have the ball puzzles, which are mildly frustrating but very rewarding. They bring the shiny system from RE5 back, so you can see a glint in various parts of the map, and shooting those will drop a sellable treasure. Like we touched on earlier with the Duke, there's the animals to hunt for ingredients to cook the recipes. There's even treasures to run around and find that get marked on your map at a certain point, and you can go do puzzles or battles to retrieve those items. Usually they're a sellable, sometimes they're actual attachments for weapons, and there's even an optional boss battle that was very exciting in its own little area off the map. All of these little touches add up to just the game feeling like it's content-packed without forcing you to backtrack too heavily to find this stuff. It really doesn't break up the pacing of the game, but you still get a lot of stuff to do outside of just driving through the main story. So to move us into the next section of our review, we want to talk about the things that we didn't like about RE8. To continue on a theme that I just touched on, pacing, I feel that the pacing of this game was actually pretty bad. You start off in Ethan's home a very disruptive event happens, and then you just wind up out in the wilderness. This brings you into a village. A big action scene happens, and then you transition into the castle. You're ready for this big Resident Evil experience of exploring a giant castle, just like the mansions from the earlier games. And in just a couple hours, you're out of there and running around to these weird locations, almost like an action game, going into separate areas, and that's where the pacing starts to get wonky. The next section after the castle is very short, it's very horror-centered, there's no combat there. Then you move from there into an almost puzzle-based area with a very, in my opinion, bad boss battle. From there you move to an even more jarring, totally combat-centered section, and the game doesn't really find its footing pace-wise again until you wind up in the final area of the game, the factory, which, in my opinion, by the way, is the best designed area in the game. But still, the entire pacing felt off. After that final area, another major scene happens. You wind up playing as Chris for a while, and it almost feels like playing Call of Duty. It's very action-centered. You literally have grenades and flashbangs and an assault weapon, which is not in the spirit of the rest of the game. And you're just mowing down Lycan quickly.
I wholeheartedly agree with the comparison that it's like the game just flips a switch and suddenly it's going into Modern Warfare with the night vision, the assault rifles, the frag grenades, the abundance of ammunition, and even more gadgets that we won't get into.
And then, just as quickly as you move into this peak action sequence, you're thrust back into playing as Ethan and his clunkiness. It's just very jarring how the game shifts between speeds so often, and I don't know if that was a development rush or if it was just a bad design plan from the beginning.
It's hard to say. Either way, it just came out like such a jarring shift. Some of you might like it, think it was cool. Others will go, wow, this is completely out of place here.
I will say, to me, on a similar note, the only boss battle in the game that really felt good and like overcoming an overwhelming odds was the battle with Lady Dimitrescu. That fight felt good. It almost even seemed like maybe a Dark Souls-esque battle where you were just overwhelmed by this power and somehow eke out winning the battle. The other boss battles in the game, not so much. The next one, you're literally chasing an object around, picking it up on a timer. The next boss battle, you can literally just corner shoot barrels to defeat the boss. The next boss battle after that is just don't get hit until you can fire back. And the final boss battle was cheap. It was literally one of 2 times I died in the entire game.
Final boss battle to me just did not feel right. It was kind of frustrating. It felt spongy.
And actually, comically, I completely forgot a boss battle that's right before that one, where you're literally driving a vehicle with a rocket launcher around.
It's like the redneck Terminator lawnmower.
It's so terrible that it's not even memorable. I don't even think you could technically call that a boss battle. It's maybe a on-rails gunning scene or something.
To me, I was laughing at it, and I kind of enjoyed it in a strange way. Just because of that, it felt so wild.
It was definitely a fun battle, but I would not say that it's in the spirit of any other part of the game or even the series. It was
for that matter.
It almost went grindhouse for one battle. It was so ridiculously over the top.
So I think that we should touch on the subject of Ethan in this game. This man puts up with a lot of hand torture in the game. And you want to respect him. He's definitely got an admirable quest to keep him driven. He's definitely determined, focused, but at the same time, he never feels like he truly shows too much of who he is to really get us that connected to him. You just feel for him and what he's doing, but not him as a person.
Yeah, I would say I would connect to his motives and his reason for doing this and wanting to save his daughter. I think even people without their own children can relate to wanting to rescue your child or rescue a loved one. But Ethan as a character himself is continuing the same rhetoric he had in Resident Evil 7, where the only 2 lines he had is, "What is going on?" and "I'm gonna save Rose."
Pretty much. That's not really an exaggeration. That's just kind of what it felt like. Was his voice lines just focus around these 2 objectives.
We do also get to find out in this game, by the way, why Ethan can survive all of these consecutive, seemingly lethal injuries that happen to him throughout these 2 games. There are several times in Resident Evil 8 particularly where I was thinking,
You should be dead.
Yeah, he should be bleeding out right now, not running away from Lady D. And somehow he keeps surviving this stuff. And then you find out why Ethan can survive all of this torture. And it's not because he loves his daughter so much he endures.
But we don't want to cross a line. It's up to you to figure it out, so just play the game and you're in for a surprise. We'll leave it at that.
One technical thing I wanted to bring up as a negative on this, the graphics looked great when they worked. On PS4, there was some really bad texture pop-in to the point where I literally watched the game load textures, adjust placement, dump the textures back to just like muddy, smudged textures, and try to load the textures again. In fact, I think we have a clip here of the game trying to load the same textures 4 separate times. One final con that I would give the game is, while the combat was solid, I feel that a lot of the guns felt same-ish. The only guns that really stood out for me were the first shotgun, the 1911 pistol, and the Magnum, and the sniper rifle. I would say the sniper rifle was the best gun in the game, actually, as far as how it felt to use and how good the gun actually was. The rest of the guns just seemed like slight variants of other weapons in the game.
Mm-hmm. And I get what he means. To me, some guns just felt better than others. I do kind of wish I held off on how much I upgraded some of them now, which I should have known because it was like RE4 in some of those respects, and how frequently you would get them. And just when I thought, okay, this is probably the last of the guns, nope, there was one more.
If I played through the game one more time, I would probably only ever upgrade capacity and reload speed on guns, honestly. You didn't even need power upgrades as long as you were a crack shot with the rifle.
Because the rifle is the one thing, from start to finish, it will be with you. The rest of the stuff is going to kind of go through the motions of, there's the next step, the next level for that gun. Some of which are kind of questionable of, you would think that this actually comes before that. To me, my personal advice is keep with the upgrades, because I do notice, at least with the shotgun especially, I think the last one did have a significant power output that came in handy throughout that final part of the game. Otherwise, yeah, it could just be your personal preference. Find what fits your style, your satisfaction, and understand that after you beat the game, you're going to have more opened up to you and available. Some of which you will only get through Mercenaries mode, but we're going to touch on that here in a moment. I want to just give my last con, because I wholeheartedly agreed with just about everything Meta said. My only extra addition is the lack of VR. This was a big deal on 7, being there with PlayStation VR, and it's a real head scratcher that it wasn't included in 8, because it feels like it should have been there. It was ripe for it, it was perfect for it, yet it wasn't. Just for whatever reason they chose not to include it. To me, that takes it down a little bit.
I'm personally not a big fan of VR, although I have experienced it, but I do think that it should have been included with this game. It was included with Resident Evil 7, at least with the DLCs to my knowledge.
And the base game.
And in fact, I can say a friend of mine has told me the most terrifying experience of their life was playing one of the DLCs from Resident Evil 7 in VR. It literally had the person in tears. So why they wouldn't include something that powerful with this new iteration of the game is just a total baffle.
They missed out on a wonderful opportunity, and hopefully it's just not them being like, well, we don't think VR is worth it, when it was a selling point for your last game. You should have continued on with it, but for whatever reason it may be, who knows if it'll be a future update or what. But really quick, we're gonna touch on a few other key things.
And I'll start with a con, one more, I guess, final con. The post-game content. While we love the Mercenaries game, I think we can both agree that we were very happy to see that return to the Resident Evil franchise. The rewards that you can get with the points earned from the Mercenaries game almost seem useless. The majority of them are concept art or 3D models, figurines, or whatever the game calls them, for the different characters and enemies, the different guns, and I've never been a big fan of that being included in games. I don't need to look at character models. I don't care much about concept art. If you want to just unlock a bundle of that for me when the game ends so I can look at it, I might thumb through it once, but I'm not going to grind Mercenaries for 15 hours to look at character models.
No, the only thing that feels like, you want to grind for is, okay, give me some cool new in-game secret weapons and maybe some of the cheat codes, because that apparently is also related to it. But otherwise...
And even those are only useful if you're going to play through the main story again. In fact, I purchased one of the weapons Chris had in his portion of the game and infinite ammo for it. And now that I'm playing back through, I just feel so overpowered I can't take the combat in the game seriously. It's just too easy, even with an infinite ammo pistol. So I can't imagine how much easier any other infinite ammo weapon would make the game.
Like an infinite ammo magnum or something, for example.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. Some people might find that more enjoyable than others, so take it for what you will. Just to continue on the final notes for the game, let's touch on sound design and music, because that's kind of a staple for Resident Evil, that it has an iconic look, it has an iconic sound, it has an iconic music behind it.
For me, if I'm remembering correctly, and I don't pay a lot of attention to music per se in games, the music was used very ambiently, it was timed with events occurring. A lot more of the sound was centered around areas that were supposed to be scary, and that sound did that very effectively with the dissonant, almost noise more so than music, but it did have some musical quality to it. The monsters sounded terrifying. The voice acting was very well done. I think the sound overall in this game was good. The weapons had a good punch sound to them. You definitely could correlate the boom to the power of the weapon.
I'd have to agree with the respect of, it has still a very Resident Evil sound with the music. One that simultaneously fits the setting, but one that simultaneously fits the iconic sound of the series itself. They were able to balance it just right, I would say. And also have to agree, yeah, the monsters, all of them sound terrifying. The guns, they all have the right sound to simultaneously be satisfying to shoot and use in combat. So it's a good balancing act that they accomplish quite well.
Quick final comment about music and sound. I have really enjoyed over the years the evolution of the toy box room music in Resident Evil. And for that music to play when you enter the area where the Duke is in its new iteration just really ties the game to the rest of the series and makes it feel like you're playing Resident Evil.
And with all things considered that we just built on now, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. But how about we give you the final summary here in a moment? We'll give you our final thoughts and hit on the key points of what made Resident Evil 8 a good game or a bad game. Here's the final thoughts. And that more or less sums up Resident Evil 8 for us. It was a charming experience. To me, it about lived up to what I would have expected from a Resident Evil game. It was an amalgamation of Resident Evil 4, just continuing off where 7 left off to me.
For me, I would say fans of Resident Evil 4 and 5 would definitely like this game if they enjoyed 7. I would put this in the horror shooter genre more than survival horror. The game would have done a lot better with better pacing and a better story, but it's still a solid entry into the series.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and going into it, that's basically all you should be looking for, is just continuation of the Resident Evil storyline from Ethan's story. If you played 7, you probably should have. It might not seem like it initially, but everything kind of ties together in the end, and it really sets a ball in motion that says, the series is probably going to continue off from here to here now.
Yeah, it ties itself to Resident Evil canon in a big way. We won't spoil it here, but it's definitely worth a play if you're into the continuing lore of the series. I would give the game an 8 out of 10.
For me, it's not that far off either. About an 8.5 out of 10, maybe even a 9. Actually, you know what? If it had VR support, I would have given it a 9. But as it stands now, yeah, I didn't have much problems. I got a good story out of it. I got fun gameplay out of it. I got what was a Resident Evil experience that kept me hooked and driven to the very end. And ultimately, it's a worthy successor to the series, another entry, and can only hope to see where it goes.
As a fan of the series, this, all pros and cons considered, was a 7, but with Mercenaries being one of my favorite things from Resident Evil, that earned a whole point by itself. That's why I give this 8 out of 10. And I'm looking forward to see, now that the father and mother story is over, what we're going to get next from this franchise.
Spot on.
Needed more me.
Understandably so. But as it sits now, you know, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us in on this. If it interests you at all, go ahead and get it now if you want. I'd say it's worthy of it. So, with all that considered, y'all take care, stay safe out there, and have a good one. See you next time.
Stop.
Just out there, shoot at the ceiling.
I can provide some beautiful voice acting for the thing and go pew pew.
I feel like we need a
What are you doing shooting holes in my castle?
Stop blowing holes in my ship. Am I cute? Of course I am.
Oh yeah, that's still recording.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that's when you're like, well, it seems two stupid man things have wandered into my castle.
Maybe you should voice act. You should play Lady Demetrius.
Alright. Okay. It's for real this time.
For all the beans.
Hi. Damn it, Melissa. There's a bean.
There's a bean. Okay. I'm very serious now.